I'd like you to think of an event where the outcome was bad or the outcome was wrong, it was evil, but the motivation of what carried that event out was good. From time to time, I come across stories with this theme, something along the lines of, right, like single mom leaves young children home alone all day to go to work or locked in the car, or a man steals in order to provide for his family. We see these stories sometimes, and I think rightly so, we sympathize with them. We see that their motivation was good, but at the end of the day, a wrong was committed. And it is this exact theme that I think Marvel capitalizes on to make some really good villains. And today I'd like to get into the villains and then also the heroes of some of the most recent productions that Marvel has published. So at the outset, I have to say that I'm going to be going over Loki, the movies with Thanos, and a little bit of WandaVision, and there's going to be some heavy spoilers. So if you've never seen those things and you want to, you should not watch this video until you watch those productions. I will also say if you haven't seen those things and you're not interested, I think you could still watch this and get a lot out of it. I'll try my absolute best to explain the details that are pertinent to our discussion. With that being said, this review sort of analysis is not going to be like your normal film review, normal TV show review, where it, especially the ones with these comic book movies where there's connections between the production and the comic books. You know, they're pointing out the little idiosyncrasies that really get enthusiasts riled up. Those reviews are really cool. I like them. I enjoy watching them after I watch one of these productions. But simply put, they do that way better than I can. I'm not that interested in putting in the work necessary to do that. And frankly, I think there's some deeper things going on. So let's dive into Loki and the Thanos movies and WandaVision. Let's see what's really going on in these productions. So with Loki, I gotta say I liked it. I thought it was a cool show. The visuals were great. I was the biggest fan of the character arc of Loki. It was really cool to see that he started as a villain in episode 1, and by episode 6 he was not necessarily a hero, but he had made a pretty great character arc, and the internal struggle that his character carried out throughout the show was particularly entertaining and I would say beneficial to watch. As cool as Loki is, I actually don't want to talk too much about him. I want to talk about Kang, the villain. So let's talk about Kang, why he's a great villain, and in some ways why I think Marvel is kind of manipulating our view of God. So it's no question that Kang is drawn up to be this godlike figure. Multiple times he says things like, I know everything, I know what's going to happen. He even has this really interesting quote where he says, I paved the road, you just walked on it. And not only did he create the timeline, not only does he know the timeline, but he also controls it too, right, with the time variant authority. That is his kind of bureaucratic enforcement wing of beings who step out of line from the timeline. If a being chooses something that is different to what they're supposed to do, they get pruned. They get, that is to say, eliminated from the timeline. I'll get into that in a little bit. Now, when Kang introduces why he's there, it's kind of interesting. So we should start out by saying this. It seems like they're trying to say that free will creates chaos and destruction. So the timelines, or what Kang says is that there's these universes that are stacked on top of each other, and you could even say different timelines that are stacked on top of each other. And when these beings interact with each other, when they have free will, the timeline starts to branch out and create all of these different branches. They start to mix, and the mixing up is not very good. Chaos and destruction ensues. A big old war throughout the multiverse happens. Kang fights a ton of his own variants, and he conquers them. And what does he do? He stamps out the timeline to where it's only one single timeline, and he controls it. It is, as he said, the paved path for the beings in the Marvel Cinematic Universe to walk on. And when, like I said earlier, if a being exercises free will, that is to say, if they do not walk on the path that was provided for them, they are pruned. And what if they're pruned, or I should say this, they give the option, you could either go back and live your life how you're supposed to, get all of your memory wiped and all that good stuff, or you can just get pruned. That is to say, wiped out of the timeline. So control is of utmost importance. Keeping the timeline intact is of utmost importance because Kang is trying to save reality from the chaos and destruction that will ensue if the timeline can branch apart. And I think there's an interesting parallel between this and the biblical narrative. In Loki, free will seems to create chaos and destruction, deviating from the timeline, right? But then in the biblical narrative, when Adam and Eve take of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, that is to say, to give themselves free will, to take the authority of calling good and evil from God and put it on themselves, death ensues, right? This is the fall. This is what casts them out of the Garden of Eden. And we'll get back to this parallel in just a moment. Now, my next point is they pit two things against each other that on the surface do seem like they're against each other, but the danger is thinking that they are the only two options, and that is free will versus determinism. Especially in the 5th and 6th episode, the idea that people actually don't have free will starts to just pop up, and they start to really speak about that reality is actually controlled, and it's people do not have free choice. Right? Even there's an agent in the TVA who says the only person who really has free will is the one who created everything. So it seems to say there is either free will or determinism. But if we have free will, chaos and destruction comes from the timeline branching out and war breaking out, a multiversal war. So there has to be determinism. There has to be utter control of the canine, the timeline. That's I guess that's Kang and timeline mixed, canine. Anyways, back to what I was saying. So to continue, we'll get back to the free will, determinism, false dialectic here in a minute. Now, another point I'd like to make is the difference between sacrifice and control. So I would say that there's really two ways to rescue from destruction, death, and chaos, and that is either sacrifice or control. So let's look at how the ultimate example of sacrifice works, and that is Christ. He is the ultimate example of sacrifice. So humanity has plunged itself into death by the fall, and if you go back, if you read through the Bible and understand what sin is, basically the whole idea of the tree of, or the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, it's not so much that Adam and Eve descended us into the fallen world, though they did. It's that each and every one of us, by taking the authority of what is good and evil and giving it to ourselves, we too plunge ourselves into death, right? I like to think that a lot of people, to illustrate this, I like to think that a lot of people, one of the questions they would love to ask in heaven when they see Adam is they'll say, when they see Adam and Eve, why did you eat of the fruit? And I think they would actually reply with, but you ate of the fruit every single day, right? So the fruit represents rebelling against God, and if God is life, then rebelling against God is rebelling against life. So the only other option is death. Okay, we have that laid out. Death covers humanity. Death is what's destined for humanity. So how are we to be saved? So sacrifice is use your power to lower yourself and take the destruction onto yourself to save or lift up the one who is lower from that destruction. Christ is the one in authority. He is the Son of God. He comes down and takes on the death that is destined for us so that we don't have to, and we can be reconciled with it. It is the one in power who is capable of taking on the destruction and surviving, right? We can't, but God can. So that is the truest form of sacrifice. Christ takes the punishment for our sins. He takes on death and conquers it so that we may have life if we choose him. Right? That's the ultimate example of sacrifice. So let's compare that with Kang. So with Christ, the outcome is man is redeemed. But with Kang, the outcome is man is controlled. I would say oppressively, right? So destruction is inevitable. Destruction is coming. So what does Kang do? He uses his power to try to stop, that is to say, prevent the destruction from taking place. And instead of taking it on himself, how he would do that, granted, I don't know. Maybe he couldn't, right? Because he's not exactly the God figure. Anyways, instead of taking that on himself, he only redistributes the destruction. And what do I mean by that? So with free will, death and destruction comes in Loki. But Kang, what he does is he takes that and he gives sentient beings two choices, and they don't know they have this choice. It's walk down the path that Kang has paved for you, or get pruned, that is to say, destroyed. So you're either oppressively controlled, or you're eliminated, death. You're out of there. He's only redistributed the destruction. And so that is why his solution is wrong. That is why he is wrong, and that is why he is a villain. And I would say a good one, right? His motivation is good, but this is in fact why his solution is wrong. But here's the issue that I have, and now I'm starting to bring the main point of this episode to the forefront, and that is no figure questions Kang's solution. No one stops for a second to think that maybe no one stops to explain why Kang is wrong in what he's doing. Loki thinks that Kang might be right? He tries to stop Sylvie from stabbing Kang, though he ultimately fails and Kang does get stabbed. He does die from Sylvie, but Loki's like, maybe Kang is right. And then there is the figure of Mobius, who says, the only thing he really says though is, like Owen Wilson, we can't just take away people's free will. That's my best Owen Wilson. I hope that was good. But he just says we can't just take away people's free will, but he doesn't exactly explain why. I mean, let's play devil's advocate here. Why not? If death is inevitable, suffering, chaos, all-out multiversal war, if that's inevitable, why not? Why not have some control in the timeline? Why not control it to a single timeline? Why not? That seems fine. But I think if you think like this, Marvel has already got you. So I think the issue that I'm seeing here is that the villain's solutions are never really addressed. And I hope I addressed the solution that Kang puts forward earlier, right? He doesn't actually solve a problem, he just redistributes the problem. Okay? And so if the solution is never addressed from the villain, a seed is planted in the viewer's mind that at the end of the day sympathizes with the villain. And so let's check the one second. Apologies, some technical difficulties. So let's see what these seeds are. Ultimately, I think it comes down to really two. Sacrificing freedom to have order so as to not risk chaos and destruction. This is to say, sacrificing freedom is a good and necessary thing. That is the seed. Another seed, I think, that is being planted is God is this controlling oppressor who cannot stand to allow you to have freedom. So now if I may go off on a tangent, follow along, you might find it interesting. So if you did pick up on this godlike figure that Kang has painted himself out to be, and frankly is in the show, you may have drawn the parallels between him and God. And it is true that, like Kang, God created our timeline. And he knows everything about the timeline. And God, we could say, even controls the timeline. But is it in the same way that Kang does it? So in the show, it's if free will comes in, death follows. So therefore, control, utter control is required. But in the biblical narrative, I don't think that's what we get. So number one, I already went over how there's sacrifice, so there's no need to have this oppressive control. And number two, I think the free will versus determinism, free will versus control, is a debate that we don't actually need to have, because I think there's a third option. And this is a school of thought called Molinism. Now this philosophy is kind of a new take on the view or on the sovereignty of God. So traditionally there was like this Arminian, that was easy for me to say, Arminianist view, which is that man does have absolute free will. And then there's the Calvinist view that nope, God has preordained everything, man has no free will. Molinism, however, says, it asks a question, what is the ultimate form of knowledge? And we can assume that God has this ultimate form of knowledge because he is all-knowing. It's not necessarily knowledge of everything that will happen, though God has that. It is the knowledge of everything that could happen. So there might have been cases in your life where you have said, man, if this would have happened, I would have done this. Like, oh man, if that car would have cut me off, man, I would have screamed and, done whatever. So that's a conditional. But in reality, that didn't happen. It's a conditional statement. So Molinism says that God knows all conditional statements, all conditional facts, if you will. So when creating reality, he took free-willed beings, such as you and I, and placed them in circumstances and saw all the possible permutations, how their free will would interact in the world. And what Molinism said is that God has used the free will beings, used their choices to create the best possible reality with the most good. And so, at the end of the day, God does have control and knowledge of the timeline, but free will is not wiped off. If any of that went completely over your head, first thing I gotta say is, if you're interested, read The Only Wise God by William Lane Craig. Short little book, but it's fantastic in breaking down Molinism. But if that went over your head, you're not interested in reading the book, this is to say, don't worry, God's knowledge of the timeline and creating reality doesn't threaten your free will. Okay, now back to the point. I would say it's a failure on Marvel to not have their heroes address the villains. Now, granted, Kang is a new villain. He is going to be the next big bad guy. So maybe they will ultimately down the road sort of address the wrong of Kang's solution. I'll be interested to see whether or not they do, but I think they have to address the wrong. Now, I think it's quite a deviation from older stories. In older stories, not only was the bad guy was evil triumphed over, but I think the hero typically gives a good explanation or reasoning behind why the villain is wrong. I think there's plenty of examples in the Old Testament in the Bible, but maybe you're not exactly a Christian and you're listening to this, and you don't want to get quite into the Bible. In that case, I would recommend like old classical literature, like from like ancient Greece and Rome. Like I was reading some Greek plays. This is a really cool compilation of plays if you're interested. I was reading the play called Antigone, and I really loved in that story how Antigone, who is the hero, and another heroic figure in that story, they kind of get up on stage and they spill it out why the villain is wrong, and they make it plain as day. Even in older Marvel movies, the heroes did this. I think Thor did this really well against Loki early on. Captain America is great examples of this. Captain America is certainly amongst the most virtuous characters in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think the three Captain Americas have good examples of him addressing why the solution is wrong, particularly in the Winter Soldier, right? When the government wants to have those ships who eliminate potentially risky targets. Again, another example of trying to control. Captain says a wonderful line. He says, every time you try to prevent a war from starting, innocent people die every time. Or no, excuse me. I took that out of, I misquoted that. He said, every time you try to win a war before it even started, innocent people die every time. And it's really true. And then even in Captain America's Civil War, right, when the government wants him to sign and say, hey, you're going to take orders from the government now, he says, I can't sign it. Why? Because of his experience with the government in Captain America 2. He says he knows that the government can be infiltrated and the government can have ulterior evil motives, so he can't sign it. He makes that out. He explains that. So it's worrisome that these more recent Marvel productions are not having the heroes being addressed. And sure, that we haven't finished the story with Kang, so be on the lookout for if heroes address him. But let's look to some stories that have been tied up, and let's look at Thanos. I think this is another good example of a villain whose solution is wrong, but his motivations seem like they're good. Right? He wanted to wipe out half of sentient life to prevent destruction from overpopulation. He wanted to prevent the suffering. Something I notice is he's never really challenged. The heroes just assume that genocide is wrong. They just assume that it's wrong, so they go after him. And yeah, it is wrong. Obviously it's wrong, and they should go after him. And Thanos is the villain, but they don't explain why it's wrong. And I'll tell you why that's important. But before that, they never end up having to explain why it's wrong, because by the end of the drama, right, in Endgame, Thanos has doubled down, and he has gone from I want to wipe out half the planet to save sentient life from suffering from overpopulation, to I'm just going to kill everyone and I'm going to wipe out the entire universe. So the viewer is left just sitting there going, yeah, get Thanos, destroy him. You don't even have to think twice. He is the big bad. Um, and and here is, I would say, the issue. There is another false dialectic that is proposed. It's either destruction by overpopulation or painless and random elimination of sentient life. But there's never another option explored. And I think it's important to have this conversation because there's a lot of talks of environmentalism and things like that today. But they never mention the resiliency of Earth and that it actually works in a cycle. But more to the point, overpopulation has been a great fear even since the 70s in the 20th century. I think even in the 70s they were predicting that within like 15, 20 years you'd have people dying of mass starvation. Look at us now, where we've increased our population significantly, and we've managed. I don't know about well, but I mean, there's still starvation. But is it at the rate that it was predicted? That I don't think it is. But more to the point, we're able to sustain ourselves on this number of population, though they thought that it was going to be significantly overpopulated. And that is because more humans equals more creativity, more innovation, more ways to come up with efficient solutions. So again, let's look at the idea of control. Thanos, he is brought up again to the figure of like a godlike figure. And he has that godlike power with the infinity gauntlet, and he uses it to prevent destruction, but again, he just redistributes it, right? Instead of half of sentient life dying from overpopulation, he just wipes them out indiscriminately. So the destruction is there no matter what. He just merely redistributes it. Now, it is interesting that the way to fully save humanity and to completely defeat death, which is Thanos. Thanos sounds like the Greek word for death, which is Thanatos. And at the end of Endgame, he says, I am inevitable. To overcome that was sacrifice, right? How Iron Man took the stones, snapped his fingers, and defeated Thanos, defeated the inevitable death of the universe. But let's bring the Thanos story back to a close here. The heroes don't really address Thanos' originally proposed solution. If left unchecked, again, you have the seed planted that perhaps the villain was right. Maybe mankind should only be viewed as a species. It's impossible to innovate to solve our problems. Even an implicit denial of God, saying that God doesn't have this whole thing under control, God being the benevolent being he is. And now the reason why I think it should be addressed is, well, actually, you know what? I'll save that. I'll save that for later when it gets to the good part, when I bring this whole podcast to a close. I also want to mention briefly WandaVision. You kind of see this. I'm just going to briefly mention this, but Wanda is so hurt by losing Vision that she ends up creating reality, if you want to say, almost another godlike figure, and she controls the minds of dozens of people, and it's a really painful experience for them, right? When Vision wakes them up, they plead for freedom. They're so much in pain, but my issue with it is somehow the pain she inflicts on people is painted as justified for healing her traumatic experiences. And then even the agent who is against her, right, who wants to save the people, he's posed as a villain. Right at the very end, Darcy slams into him with a big old truck and says like, "I hope you go to prison," or "See you in prison," or something like that. But meanwhile, the agent, maybe he did have some nefarious and ulterior motives, but ultimately he wanted to rescue the people from Wanda's control. So now, to tie all of these together, at the end of the day, all of these stories are inversions. The heroes become the villains and vice versa. That's the risk we run without having their solutions addressed. Let's take Thanos. Could it really be the case that Thanos was the hero? So just think about this. If Thanos was right, that, let's grant that he was right, that suffering from overpopulation was inevitable. Would you take the suffering that is inevitable from overpopulation over an indiscriminate, painless wisping away of, half of sentient life? You have to admit that there is an ethical discussion to be had there. Now, I already explained why he's wrong, right? Because he just redistributes the suffering and the death by taking half of sentient life away and causing the suffering of the people who are still there. But if he was right, then what did the heroes do? The heroes brought back the rest of humanity. And so what's inevitable now for them is suffering from overpopulation. Again, that's if Thanos was right. And I think that is all in the background of the story because they never address why Thanos is wrong. And I don't think it's any coincidence that after the movie, there was like a hashtag like, "Was Thanos right?" We never really get it settled, do we? At least from the movie, and it does spark a very interesting question. If suffering is inevitable, and then let's look at Kang. Right, if Kang was right, that destruction and chaos and death was coming because of free will, then stopping him was a bad thing. It was, right? That's why Loki, interesting, the character who straddles the line of hero and villain, thinks Kang might be right. He does kind of begin to be a hero by the end of the story, but then he hears Kang out, and then he goes, maybe Kang was right. So stopping Kang unleashed all of the destruction, chaos, and death. And now look at Wanda. How can Wanda be the hero when she is really controlling everyone and making them suffer? But by the end of the show, she just walks off, having somewhat healed from her experience. Now it's true that Agatha was making things a little worse, but it was Wanda who initiated the mind control. So I just want to reiterate, I'm not saying these villains are right, but because they're never addressed, because they never get challenged as to why they're wrong, they just get defeated. Their ideas never get defeated, though. Because that happens, these seeds are left in our mind that perhaps they could have been right. And so now I want to ask a deeper question here. Do the creators of these productions have something to gain by creeping these messages, planting these seeds into your minds? Now, it's true. People who own entertainment are very powerful. People who own Disney are very powerful, very wealthy. And they are powerful in the sense that they have connections to other elites, but also in the sense that they have the ability to sway culture, maybe even public thought. And I would argue it's by these sort of subconscious seed implantations, if you will. Um, Now, let's look at the seeds that they've kind of implanted. From Kang in Loki, control is needed to save us from chaos and destruction. From Thanos in Infinity War and Endgame, humans are reduced to simply a species, and nature is of more importance than humans. And then with WandaVision, reality should be bent to the individual and their personal feelings. And as far as applying that to society now, I'll let you think about whether or not you see these themes in society. And just remember these stories. They are inversions. And that's why we need to be wary of the creators. Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And it's a dangerous story that you tell when you have a villain who is motivated by a good thing, but in the end their solution is wrong, and you never address why their solution is wrong. That's when it becomes blurry. There was a good motivation, but the solution was wrong. Where did it go wrong? Did they just poorly execute it, or were they really right? Was it that they needed to bring in necessary evil to prevent a bigger evil? I think these are kind of the second guesses that you're left with, right? That maybe these villain solutions are necessary evils that needs to come into reality, that comes into society. But again, at the end of the day, they are wrong, and I hope that in the future, these type of movies, the heroes are able to address why the villains are wrong, outright and completely. So to wrap this up, when a villain proposes their solution, listen for the hero's response. When there isn't one, ask why, and at least try your best to figure out why the solution is wrong, even though the motivation could be right. Right? We grant that. And just a reminder, you will need a moral framework to work through the problem. And might I suggest Christianity. That is, if you find my analysis to be anywhere on the mark, then maybe you have just found some powerful evidence to the coherence of Christianity. And if you found me completely unconvincing, crackpot, and out of my mind, nonsensical, then the problem is certainly with me and not Christianity, because it's survived for over 2,000 years, and I've only been around for about 21. So with that being said, I really appreciate you listening this far. I really enjoy taking apart the popular culture stuff. You can't just sit there and expect that this is just entertainment for entertainment's sake. There are messages in these stories. All stories have messages, and it's when these messages start to blur the lines of good and evil. It's when these messages start to mimic some wrong. That's when we should really take notice, and that's when we should really discuss it and think about it. Because if we don't, if we just take it in, entertainment for entertainment's sake, these seeds, these messages, these wrong messages are just pumped into our subconscious, and ultimately our reality, our framework for choosing is distorted. So these things are important, and I hope if this is the first time you've engaged in an analysis of this depth, then I invite you to continue to do it, and hopefully I'll be able to look at some more popular culture stuff and do this sort of analysis. It's really fun for me. All right. Thank you very much again for listening. I hope I see you in the next podcast. As always, if you have questions, comments, please drop them down below. I'll address them in the next podcast. I'm really not a fan of just coming up with my own stuff. I'm more of a fan of engaging with my listeners. So tell me what you think. Agree, disagree, questions, comments, concerns. Want to hear it all. All right. Thanks for listening. Take care. And have a good rest of your day. All right. Bye now.